1950s or 60s. But when it emerged as a pressing health emergency in the 1980s, it had already been known by at least the faction of the intelligence community that my father and others were part of in Project Pegasus at least 10 years before it became a major issue in contemporary civilization. I remember a very young but a very friendly and buoyant Bill Clinton saying, you know, I know that you gentlemen are for real. I know that you're associated with the atomic research community and everything, but I have to tell you that some days, since you told me all this, I wake up and I look in the mirror, I look at myself in the mirror and I pinch myself and I say, me, Bill Clinton, President of the United States? I mean, gentlemen, that dog don't hunt. Let's look at why they use children in these new dangerous and experimental activities. Activities in which, of the 140 children, I know personally one of the boys lost his feet permanently while teleporting to Santa Fe as a result of arriving standing in 3 inches of water that had gathered in a public fountain. And one of the girls, we were told when we were being trained in chronovision, had lost her vision as a result of looking up at the crystal array of the chronovisor when it was rendering the hologram. And that light was so bright that she became blind and her visual cortex was destroyed. So I'm speaking out also for that reason, that the public, particularly the American public, deserves to be told that American school children paid a heavy price for the evolution of the time travel technology that is one of the secret technical feats of American civilization. But why kids? Well, first, we were experimentees, no doubt about it. I resist the term guinea pig because the time travel technologies, for the most part, had been made safe. The incident involving the boy losing his feet, the girl becoming blind, those were accidents, and accidents happen to children while they're time traveling. Children are killed in car accidents, they're killed in train wrecks, they're killed in air disasters. When we were utilized as child chrononauts, certainly my father and Dr. Agnew and the other conscientious people in the program were convinced that the technologies were safe because they were not only using a cadre of American school kids, they were traveling in the devices themselves. And so if they had been disinterested, I don't think they would have done that. But they were concerned about our well-being. Every step was taken to make the different jumps safe. But nonetheless, we were experimentees because every time we would teleport to New Mexico, we would arrive in Santa Fe, and then Bill Richardson would take roll. We would then be placed aboard a school bus by Jack Pruitt, and we would be bused up to an old school site that then existed in Lamy, New Mexico. That facility is now a private residence off of Highway 33, out there in the town of Lamy, New Mexico. And it was at that old school site where we would be medically examined, basic parameters, heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, temperature, and then we would take about 2 hours of standardized testing involving questions not unlike questions that appear on standardized tests like the SAT and the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. So they were testing the physical and mental effects, that is to say, the physiological and cognitive impacts of teleportation on bright, healthy children from stable family backgrounds. Now, why would they need that? Well, I think because they were planning to send not just the president and other cabinet officials, other intelligence community and military officials via teleportation, but their children. Certainly the first children would have to be teleported. For example, if they were to use teleportation to urgently send the president and first lady to a foreign location or extract them in an emergency in such a foreign country. So they wanted to know whether children could bear up under the teleportation experience, and in fact we did, except for the accidents, of course, which the children were not responsible for. And my father actually was proud because he used to brag to his colleagues that of all the tests I took during that cognitive testing in Laming, I think I missed one problem. And that testing went on for the entire summer. And we were teleporting regularly to Santa Fe in summer of 1970 while ostensibly enrolled in summer school back at our elementary school in Morris Plains. And my dad said I missed one problem, and it was an algebra problem. And because I hadn't yet entered the 6th grade, I hadn't been exposed to algebra. But he says, you did pick the next best answer. So he was proud that I held up and was able to maintain my cognitive integrity on the destination of the teleportation tunnel. We also, in some cases, were what I call necessities. We were necessary participants because, for example, the hologram propagated by the three-dimensional chronovisor was so unstable that the physiology of an adult chrononaut would disrupt the hologram. So they needed to train small, bright human beings to be the observers while in the hologram, to use that form of time travel to gather intelligence. And so they made a decision to select and train a relatively small cadre of gifted and talented American school children, train them for time travel, and then use them as necessary elements in the program. And that's, for example, how we ended up being involved in the chronovisor probes. While in the chronovisor probes, in a past event, for example, on a physio-virtual basis, or when jumping to a past event via some other form of physical time travel, we were participant observers. And as children, we were prized as participant observers. We were what I call viewees, because children are what Jack Pruitt described as tabula rasa. They are blank slates, and they tend to have more keen observations and perceptions of unconventional scenes because their conclusions about what they're looking at are not colored by the selection bias of their previous experiences. One of the instructors used the example that when they send an adult to the future, if the adult thinks they see a firearm in somebody's holster on their hip, they conclude that it's a pistol. But if you send children and the child sees that kind of device, the child looks at what's in the holster with a view to understanding what's really there, not what they think is there. And the child might see that it's some kind of scientific implement and not a weapon in the holster of the person they're observing. So knowing that children were tabula rasa, they had a programmatic goal of using children as participant observers in the program because they could trust our perceptions and what we were reporting back about what we were seeing while time traveling. I think the major reason we were involved is because we were trainees. I was sitting next to my father and Donald Rumsfeld when my father, as the technical liaison between Parsons and the CIA on teleportation, and Secretary Rumsfeld, as the defense attaché for Project Pegasus, were discussing the fact that the children in Project Pegasus, upon reaching high school graduation, would be admitted to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, and in Rumsfeld's words, and we will use their enrollment at Annapolis as a pretext for involving them in future project activities. So clearly we were going to be dropped into the U.S. Navy, and it was from there that we would be involved as adults in different forms of time travel to gather intelligence for the U.S. government. So that describes the different technologies. That explains why I've stated that there are 8 technologies. Some clearly are just cyclical methodologies. Some involve time travel technologies that sort of send you to a non-local location, but sort of keep you back in the laboratory. But the last 4 were clearly devices that were physically sending us someplace. Some requiring a return device on the destination, such as the Tesla teleporter, some not. For example, in plasma confinement, you just have this sort of kundalini sensation and you find yourself back in the laboratory. So they were trying to develop physical teleportation that wouldn't require a device on the end, so that essentially at that point all of time-space would be accessible by repositioning somebody in some other location in the time-space continuum. So here in part 4, let's take a look at the findings. By findings, I mean, what do I know that they knew back then? That is to say, what did the advent of time travel technologies permit the U.S. government to do in terms of ascertaining future events? Well, for one thing, I know that they knew about the looming resignation of President Richard Nixon on August 9th of 1974, because prior to June of 1973, they were talking about it. In fact, I went past 2 CIA people in a bar or a restaurant scene in Albuquerque, and one said to the other, so it looks like Nixon gets ensnared in a controversy called Watergate and is forced to resign the presidency. And the other one just kind of slumped on his table or the bar and said, oh, Christ. So this was one of the psychological dimensions of gathering information about future events. You were getting that information before others were, and it had a discrete psychological impact of having to suddenly find out something surprising or grievous about the future. One of those, for example, was the emergence of AIDS, of HIV/AIDS as an epidemic disease. I remember Connie Chavez seeing something in one of the chronovisor arrays while not standing in the hologram, but looking at the hologram. And there was a discussion of any change in sexual mores and sexual behavior. To explain why individuals were engaging in more autoerotic sexual activity, Connie suggested, well, isn't there a disease that emerges where you can catch a lethal disease from somebody as a result of sexual intercourse? And somebody said, yes, there is. It emerges we think in the 70s, and it's a social issue by the 1980s. So while AIDS and HIV was not referenced as a medical term, some of the behavioral changes in civilization towards more prudential sexual behavior was identified via chronovision, and the advent of AIDS was identified non-locally via the U.S. time-space capability. That means that when AIDS did emerge as a social phenomenon, not epidemiologically speaking, that could have been in the 1950s or 60s, but when it emerged as a pressing health emergency in the 1980s, it had already been known by at least the faction of the intelligence community that my father and others were part of in Project Pegasus at least 10 years before it became a major issue in contemporary civilization. I also know that they knew about the advent of the internet going 20 years into the future, because in a restaurant in Albuquerque, John Alexander McCone of the CIA was trying to explain to my late father what this thing called the internet was. And in my memory work, I recovered basically a verbatim statement, a verbatim quoting of Mr. McCone. And my dad was trying to understand what he was talking about. And he said, Ray, it's a global communication system where anybody on the system can communicate with anybody else on the system. And it's essentially the person sits at a keyboard, not unlike the keyboards that are starting to emerge on our electrical typewriters, or electric typewriters, and looks at a CRT or a VDT. I don't know what abbreviation you use, and sits at a video display terminal, not unlike a modern television set, and through this device can communicate with anybody else in the system. It's clearly a reduction to practice of Vannevar Bush's primary fundamental. McCone was making the point that the defense scientist Vannevar Bush had predicted the emergence of a device that would allow somebody to organize their entire life and their interaction with other people. And so McCone thought that was the internet. I think he was right. And then my dad said, but what is this .com thing? And McCone said, Ray, that's an address on the communication system. It stands for communication. We found that there are different suffixes attached to each address on the system, like .com for communication with somebody else, .edu for communication with an educational institution, and .gov for communication with a governmental agency. And my dad said, I'm still disturbed by this .com thing. And McCone said, why, Ray? It's just an address. And my dad said, how do we know that? Maybe it means Well, maybe it means that the commies have taken over by then. So that gives a kind of a picture of the fact that while time travel gave this group of people working for the defense technical community prior knowledge of some future events and conditions, they by no means had omniscience about what the future held. They were getting snapshots. They were seeing major trends, things like people sitting at their internet connections, things, for example, like the widespread use of cell phones. When they were tuning in just mundane images of things like street scenes, as my father explained to me shortly before his death in 1990, in January of 1990, one of the things they found was the advent of widespread mobile phone use, as he said in the terminology of the late 1980s. And I said, how did you know that? And he said, well, we set up the chronovisor images, and we saw you all walking around talking these little walkie-talkies. So 20 years before McCaw Cellular pioneered the mobile phone, or at least 10 years before then, the U.S. Defense Department was aware that cell phones were going to become part of our everyday life, our everyday situations. They were also detecting very disturbing events. For example, my dad and I were once, my father was called down on an emergency basis. I went with him to the Aerojet Corporation facility in Socorro, New Mexico. And it was there that we were shown moving images of one of the planes hitting one of the twin towers, which were just being finished around that time. One was finished, the tower was finished in 71, one was completed in 1973. But around the time that they had already gone up and were being completed in downtown Manhattan, this faction of the U.S. Defense Department and intelligence community had moving images of at least that part of the terror attacks of September 11th, 2001. And I'm speaking out about Project Pegasus because 3,000 human beings died that day, and the United States waged war in Iraq and Afghanistan based on the war on terror that emerged after 9/11. And I believe that the American people have a right to know that 30 years before September 11th of 2001, moving images of the terror attacks of that day found their way into Defense Department files. Now, do I know whether the Bush administration let 9/11 happen or perpetrated the event as a result of Project Pegasus having prior knowledge of the event? No, I certainly don't. In the time-space age, unlike the previous era, present knowledge of a future event doesn't implicate somebody in wrongdoing. All it is future knowledge. I mean, if somebody has future knowledge, for example, prior to the advent of time travel, of, let's say, a bank robbery, they are either the person who perpetrates the event or is an accomplice to the event or an accessory after the fact or before the fact, but by not preventing or reporting the event or revealing who they know committed the crime. But we have to remember that with the advent of time travel, you can have knowledge of something from the future. You can have knowledge of multiple things that happen in the future, not just crimes, but catastrophes that befall individuals, and not be complicit in those crimes or those catastrophes simply by having prior knowledge of the event. And how much knowledge do you share when you begin to have more and more knowledge of future events? There's serious complications that would result socially, such as is the theme of the feature film Minority Report. If, for example, we began arresting people for future crimes, we can't have a division of pre-crime in the Justice Department because they're, as a result of knowing somebody's going to commit a specific crime, you're still holding them criminally liable for something they haven't done yet. And that's not ethical. It's not jurisprudentially sound. But that is the situation we've been in since around 1970, because time travel has allowed different factions within the U.S. government to have awareness, to have knowledge of future events and conditions. Among those is the final thing we'll look at, which is the identity of future presidents. Here are the presidents that I know the U.S. Defense Department knew were destined to be presidents of the United States in our time, in our generation. The first was President Jimmy Carter of Georgia. I know that President Jimmy Carter's presidency was known to the government. I don't know if Mr. Carter was apprised of it, because when I was serving on Project Pegasus, they had a copy of Alfred Lambremont Webre's book, literally the founder of Exo University, of Alfred's book, Exopolitics. And when my father was showing that 2005 book, to Connie Chavez, she not only said, who is Alfred Lambremont Webre, the author of this book that I was identified as the editor of, but there's a quotation from President Carter that Alfred placed in the frontispiece pages of his book. And Connie also asked my father, who is President Jimmy Carter? Do they know who he is? And my father stated, I can't remember whether he said he's currently the governor of Georgia or the lieutenant governor of Georgia, but he referenced President Carter's prior service at the state level in his native Georgia. And so I know that they had the identity of James Earl Carter of Georgia as a future American president. I know that they also had prior knowledge of this man, President George Herbert Walker Bush, and also his son, George Walker Bush, being future president of the United States, because I was at a late lunch, early dinner at the La Hacienda restaurant in Albuquerque, New Mexico, during the 1970-71 time frame, when both Presidents Bush were there with Barbara Bush, the wife of George Herbert Walker Bush and the mother of President George W. Bush. And it was at that dinner that a 24, 25-year-old George W. Bush was circulating around the dinner tables where project people were sitting and joking, have you heard, my daddy and I are going to be president. I know that both Presidents Bush were apprised of their destinies because young George W. Bush was circulating among all the tables in the restaurant where he knew project people were present, and he was joking, have you heard, my daddy and I are going to be president, joking that a father and son could serve as president in a coterminous term. And so we know from that personal encounter with the Bushes that my father and I had, not only that the government knew that they would be president, but that they themselves knew of this future information. I also know that President William Jefferson Clinton, Bill Clinton, knew that he was a future president because, again, at the La Hacienda, I was present at a lunch in which his presidency was being discussed. Not as something that was being planned to place him in office, but as a future event that a faction within the U.S. government had awareness of because of the advent of time travel. And I remember a young Bill Clinton, very young Bill Clinton at that lunch saying, well, let me just tell you who was there first. Present there was my father, Joe Conason of Parsons, Dr. Harold M. Agnew of Los Alamos National Labs, and Dr. Ivan Browning, the Director of Science and Technology for CIA. And this kind of shows what was going on. They were bringing the future presidents that they identified through the social network of Project Pegasus. So the very people who had developed the technology that allowed for this, for these future predictions to be made, this future information to be gathered, were meeting with the future presidents so they would know who they were dealing with. And that the predictions therefore were valid. And I remember a very young but a very friendly and buoyant Bill Clinton saying, I know that you gentlemen are for real. I know that you're associated with the atomic research community and everything, but I have to tell you that some days, since you told me all this, I wake up and I look in the mirror, I look at myself in the mirror and I pinch myself and I say, me, Bill Clinton, President of the United States? I mean, gentlemen, that dog don't hunt. Okay, so very humble and self-effacing Bill Clinton, possibly as young as he was when he attended Georgetown University as an undergraduate, prior to his attendance of Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, was present at that lunch shortly after he had been informed that he was a future president of the United States, and like a young George W. Bush, was coping with what he'd been told. I remember that George Bush Sr. seemed to be taking it more in stride. But of course, he was at midlife already at that time. He was approximately 45 around the time that apparently he was informed of the fact that he was destined to be president of the United States. Now, the fact that our current president of the United States, our 44th president, Barack Hussein Obama, was also apprised of his destiny as president, that involves a somewhat more complicated story. And it's multifaceted, so let me explain. President Barack Obama, then using the name Barry Soetoro, was one of the 10 young people who was tapped for the Mars Jump Room training program that I attended in the summer of 1980 under Major Ed Dames at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California. And in that context, I became aware via several individuals aligned with the Central Intelligence Agency that both Barry Soetoro and myself had been identified by the CIA as future American presidents. The first anecdote began when I was sitting in front of my father, Raymond F. Basiago, and William B. Stillings, the American chrononaut, was sitting to my right with his father, Thomas J. Stillings, sitting behind him. My dad, of course, was employed with the Ralph M. Parsons Company. Thomas Stillings was an employee of the Lockheed Corporation, then working at the Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California. And clearly, like my father, had reporting requirements to the Central Intelligence Agency because during one incident in class, Barry Soetoro, which was the name that President Obama was then using, his Indonesian name, got up. He was sitting in front of us and got up to talk to the instructor, Major Ed Dames. And Tom Stillings leaned into the aisle between his son and himself and my father and I. There were three parents auditing the class, in addition to our dads. Stanley Ann Dunham, the mother of Barry Soetoro, was also auditing the class. And when Barry got up to talk to the instructor, Tom Stillings leaned forward and said, "Brett, how do you feel being in a Mars training program like this with a future president of the United States?" And Tom nodded his head towards Barry. But before William Stillings could answer, my father thrust two fingers into the aisle and, looking at me, said, "Two future presidents." And as my dad did so, I remember that his eye was twitching. He had kind of a nervous tic where when he was discussing something that was causing him emotional consternation, his eye would twitch, the muscle in his right eye would twitch. And I remember that Tom Stillings reacted with some surprise that, in fact, there were two future presidents in the class, two individuals who had been identified via the quantum access capability that time travel technology afforded the U.S. intelligence community by around 1970, would one day serve as chief executive of the United States. I also remember that we had a going-away dinner at a restaurant near campus that was called the Creamery Restaurant. Today it's a tavern. It's a pub called the Creamery. But in those days, the restaurant was on the front side of the building on College Avenue there, that if you drive further down, you'll reach the front gate there of College of the Siskiyous. And I remember that I was sitting across from Barry and his mother. Barry was diagonal to myself, and his mother was on his left. So Stanley Ann Dunham was somewhat down the table. But I remember that a number of times during dinner, she referred to the fact that she knew that her son was going to be the first African-American president of the United States. She not only stated that he could serve in that capacity, but that he would. In other words, she wasn't referring to his talent, to his ambition, to his capability to run for president and win and serve ably and well as president. She was stating that she knew, basically to a dispositive certainty, that he would one day serve as president. After I served in the jump room program, I also had a kind of a coincidental or serendipitous meeting with Barry Soetoro after he had adopted the name Barack Obama. I was talking to a white South African anti-apartheid activist on the UCLA campus, somebody who was lobbying for divestment by the University of California from its holdings in the white racist apartheid government of South Africa, which was a major political cause of the early 80s. And I began speaking to this South African about different ideas that I had in political economy. I was doing a lot of reading in political science as a history major at UCLA, and we were discussing the impact that the transnational corporations would have on the world over the course of the next generation. I think we've seen some of those changes. And the South African stated, well, you know, I have a house guest right now. He's a poli-sci major at Columbia, and I'm sure that he would be fascinated by your idea. So what I'd like to suggest is that when I'm done with my political work here, we go over in my car and I'll introduce you to this individual. We did so. About an hour later, we drove in his Volkswagen Bug over from Lot 6 at UCLA to a rental house near off of San Vicente Boulevard near Bundy. And I entered the home that this South African was renting and was soon introduced to an individual who introduced himself as Barack Obama. But actually, before he mentioned his name, he looked at me with a quizzical turn of his head and said, "We know each other, don't we?" Well, there was every reason for Barack Obama to remember me because in addition to serving in the jump room program and actually being on several jumps together, once that I can recall in the jump room and twice on the surface of Mars or wherever in fact they were sending us, we also had roomed together briefly at College of the Siskiyous because three of us were selected out to teleport to the beginning of the summer and spend several months, not several weeks, but several months providing our input to a threat assessment that the CIA was then drafting regarding the humanoid civilization on Mars. Essentially, the CIA was promulgating a report based on about 4 inches of briefing documents about Mars, asking whether or not the humanoid civilization on Mars presented a threat to the humanoid civilization on our planet, namely to us. And so, in addition to Barack Obama and I, Regina E. Dugan, who was another one of the students who President Obama would appoint the first female director and the 19th director, historically speaking, of DARPA on July 20th of 2009, teleported using Tesla technology forward in time and met with Ed Dames in June, not in August of 1980. In fact, Ed said, "I know that that meeting takes place because I was there. The difference is you three haven't gone back to the beginning of the summer again to meet with me. But what you'll do is teleport back to the summer and spend 2 to 2.5 months in seclusion here at the college working on your contribution to the CIA's threat assessment regarding the humanoid civilization on Mars." In fact, one of the jumpers that I'm in communication with, Bernard Mendez, read that entire report and remembers how there was a panel where different individuals of different ages and backgrounds in the United States were asked to provide their input into what they thought the documents meant. So there was clearly a decision made to have the three of us provide our input into that study. And so during those several months, I roomed for a time with Barry Soetoro. But in fact, what happened is we had an argument about affirmative action. I was taking the position that affirmative action was essentially a mistaken doctrine because it tried to right offenses that were committed against the collective of people by discriminating against individuals, namely the Caucasians who would give up opportunities that they had earned meritocratically on behalf of minority group members who would be given certain opportunities based on being members of a discrete ethnic group rather than necessarily demonstrating merit. And so I offended a young Barack Obama, and at that point forward, he wouldn't talk to me while we were rooming together, so I asked for a different dorm room. But we did room together for several weeks before that discussion was held. And I remember that he was reading briefing documents that didn't relate to the Mars threat assessment, but that related to issues germane to the presidency. He described how he was being provided readings in constitutional law, foreign policy, different threats that would emerge, or public policy challenges that would emerge during the course of his administration. I certainly haven't been provided such briefing documents, so I'm either not being briefed or, in fact, perhaps on one timeline I don't reach the U.S. presidency. I'm not certain that it's critical that I do, although I will be pursuing the U.S. presidency as a candidate for 2016. But essentially, it was clear to me that after being identified as a future American president, Barack Obama was being groomed to the extent that somebody was giving him an advanced education in political science germane to the U.S. presidency. So it makes sense that his mother was identifying him as a future president during a going away dinner together. But in this discussion with him about the corporations held now in 1983, when I didn't recognize him as the young man I knew back in the days of the jump room. For example, he was older, he was more outgoing, he was more proactive in his behavior. When I met him in 1983, he was taller, thinner, using a different name first and last. He was formerly Barry Soetoro, and now this person introduced himself to me as Barack Obama. And I didn't know it was the same individual. We had somewhat of an argument about our beliefs, and as that argument escalated, the white South African who was our host said to me, "You better be nice to him, Andy, because he's going to be president of the United States someday." So here we have an operations analyst for the Lockheed Corporation with a professional relationship to the CIA, namely Thomas J. Stilling, somebody who had worked for the Office of Naval Intelligence as a Lieutenant JG when he was still serving in the U.S. Navy. The mother of Barry Soetoro / Barack Obama, Stanley Ann Dunham, and a white anti-apartheid friend from South Africa, all knowing that the young man that I served in the jump room program and now was meeting several years later when he was using a different name, was destined to reach the U.S. presidency. So in my personal experience, by my personal reckoning, I can state that Jimmy Carter was known to the government as a future president. I don't know whether President Carter was apprised of his destiny. But I know to a personal certainty, having met them after they were briefed on their presidency, that George W. Bush, his son, and William Jefferson Clinton were apprised of their presidencies literally decades, as well, I might add, as Barack Obama, literally decades before they were elected president and served as president. And I'm, as a candidate for president, ultimately, I'm sharing the truth with the American people rather than relent or participate in that historical cover-up, because I want to serve the truth more eagerly than I just simply want to serve and be elected president. I would rather lose the presidency by telling the truth to the American people than gain it by concealing the fact that the way in which the American people select their chief executive, as outlined in the Constitution, has been undermined, at least to the extent that the winners of the elections have received prior notification of their presidencies. In all honesty, did I receive such information? Yes, I did. Not only my father's statement, but information shared with me by Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA indicated that at least on one major timeline, I do become president, but I wasn't told when I would become president, at what age I would be, what year it would be, simply that I would one day serve as president. I don't know if that's through election. I don't know if that's through succession as a vice president or some other cabinet officer. It was simply information that was shared with me by two individuals aligned with the CIA. And so that is an implication of time travel that a society that has been lied to about time travel cannot even fathom. The notion that time travel is real and that the CIA could be promulgating, for example, reports of future events based on it remains a heretical notion. But in fact, time travel not only exists, but it has secretly affected the U.S. presidency in a way that creates an ongoing constitutional crisis in the United States, and that's why I'm speaking out. So those are some of the things that the quantum access capability that Project Pegasus gave the United States government resulted in the U.S. government doing over the next several decades. Knowing about future events like 9/11, future conditions like the advent of the internet, and even highly esoteric data such as the identity of a particular person who would serve as president, who would serve as vice president. I remember there was a discussion that the young 25-year-old staffer, Bill Richardson, would end up governor of the very state that we often found ourselves in, namely New Mexico. That discussion, again, being held among project principals at the La Hacienda restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque. So by the mid-1970s, even in the early 1970s, the time-space capability that Project Pegasus gave the United States government was being used by individuals in the program themselves to identify what would happen to some of the participants. Indeed, it may have been back when I was a child on Project Pegasus that it was learned that I would one day serve as President of the United States, because that would explain why I was invited to the lunches with the Bushes and with Bill Clinton, and placed in the same program as a fourth future President, Barack Obama. That is, to expose me to the reality of their presidencies, but also to be given the opportunity to see that they were just people like everybody else. But of course, it was probably proper that some form of notification occurred in this way once the capability to do so existed, because, as you know, Harry Truman said shortly after he learned that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died and that he would be sworn in as president, Truman said that he felt like the weight of the entire world had been placed on his shoulder and was driving him into the ground. So I think the right decision was made, given the great responsibilities of our chief executives in all of our countries, most especially a country like the United States. I think it's a good thing that quantum access was used so that individuals who ultimately are tasked with great responsibility are given psychological, a sense of psychological notice. They're not groomed for the presidency, but prepared to cope with the stresses and demands of office once they reach that position in life. Of course, in the case of Barack Obama, it looks like that some grooming was also going on, and that is, once after being identified as president, he was being given briefing documents to prepare him for office. So now that we've covered what some of the findings were of Project Pegasus in the early 70s that actually underlie some of the hidden history of the 80s and 90s and the last 12 years since the turn of the century, let's take a look at 3 examples of the kind of investigation that I performed. Here in Part 5, the investigation, I'd like to show how I correlated different facts from my experience with different facts that ultimately were publicly available, especially because of the advent of the internet, which indeed was one of the future conditions that Project Pegasus was aware of as a result of time travel. In this slide, we again see Dr. Agnew, a very principled individual. I remember every time I passed him in the hall somewhere in New Mexico, he would always poke me in the belly button with his right index finger. Very friendly guy, always very considerate of my father and I. What I did with Dr. Agnew is I remembered a set of events during one day in New Mexico. So when I was doing my memory work into my experiences, I remembered that I had been at the Los Alamos National Labs in Los Alamos, New Mexico with my father and several other engineers from the Ralph M. Parsons Company. And these would be during periods when I would spend several hours or days or weeks in New Mexico after teleporting there. And then at the end of those periods of residence with my father in New Mexico, he would drive me to Sandia. I would jump through the Tesla teleporter there at the Sandia National Labs and arrive at Curtis Wright in New Jersey about a half hour or an hour after I'd originally left. So these are little interludes in time, or quantum sequelae, that resulted by the fact that they were using time loops to conceal the time travel program. We were jumping to New Mexico, spending time there, and then when we were teleporting back to New Jersey, there was an adjustment backward in time so that our absence wasn't noted by our mothers and by our siblings and classmates and so forth. So I remember this incident when I was at the labs with my father and several other Parsons personnel who were on the project. And then we carpooled in several cars down to the La Hacienda restaurant for dinner in Old Town Albuquerque. And as we were disembarking from our vehicles, one of the other Parsons engineers came up to my father and said, "Ray, the word is that the director is going to be joining us for dinner tonight. I wanted to apprise you of that fact. I wanted you to know that so that you could prepare for that." Of course, Parsons had a corporate interest in retaining its contract with Lano and with DARPA to work in research and development of time travel technologies, because obviously it was a critical project. Presumably it was a very lucrative project for Parsons, and we know that at the time of his death in 1974, Ralph M. Parsons was at least a centimillionaire, and that the Ralph M. Parsons Company was already a billion-dollar corporation. And so I remembered a set of critical facts, because then we went into the La Hacienda restaurant, and everybody was seated at a long table. Actually, several tables were sort of pushed together. And when Dr. Agnew arrived 10 or 15 minutes later, he sat directly across from me. And I noticed that none of the Parsons engineers was talking to him. And so I was able to put together 5 critical facts. One was the name Agnew, which of course was then the surname of the Vice President of the United States, Spiro Agnew. In fact, I leaned across the table when I saw that the Parsons engineers were intimidated by the presence of one of their major representatives of one of their contractors. Namely, by 1970, 71, Harold was the director of Los Alamos National Labs. So I put together the name Agnew. I said to him, "Are you any relation to Spiro Agnew?" And he stuck his finger in the air and said, "Nope, not that I know of." And so I put together the name Agnew, the fact that he was a highly placed official at the Los Alamos National Labs, that this event had to take place in 1970 or 71 based on my activities in New Mexico on Project Pegasus, the professional position director, and also an anecdote that occurred at a lunch in which Dr. Agnew was so cheap that he refused to pick up his own lunch tab. It was kind of a running joke that he felt he was underpaid as the director of the lab, so he's never picking up his lunch bill. And so I Googled Agnew Lanel, L-A-N-L, for Los Alamos National Labs, and director, and I found biographical information about the person we worked with. In other words, working from memory, I identified those search terms, and then using Google, the search engine on the internet, I found that the person named Agnew, who had the same appearance as the individual that I met when I was on the project, was in fact director of the Los Alamos National Labs of all organizations, and possessed the professional title director, had the same spelling of his surname as Vice President Spiro Agnew. And there were some anecdotes that I found both on the internet and then when I interviewed people in New Mexico that yes, in fact, it was a running joke that Harold was somewhat parsimonious about spending his own money. So I was able to use the internet and then field investigations that I did in New Mexico in 2003, 4, and 8, each about 10 days in length, to pursue these facts and establish to a personal and historical certainty that the director of the program that I was in was the Manhattan Project physicist, Dr. Harold Agnew, who in fact served as the director of the Los Alamos National Labs from 1970 to 1978. I conducted a similar factual comparison, or utilized a similar factual investigation technique regarding my trip to Gettysburg. In fact, I lectured about my trip to Gettysburg before I did this factual test. But here's what I put together. I remembered that when I walked into downtown Gettysburg, which was more or less, I think at most there were 4 or 5 stores with a common wooden sidewalk, and the store frontage was actually broken up. The main street was simply dirt, which certainly would have become muddy if it had been raining, but it wasn't. It was November and very cold, but it wasn't damp. I remembered that when I walked up onto the wooden sidewalk with about 5 establishments connected, I was looking into a shop that looked like it had men's clothes in it because I wanted to go inside actually and get a jacket. And as I did so, an elderly gentleman hopped up onto the wooden sidewalk on the street in Gettysburg that would have headed into a residential area. And this was relatively early in the morning on November 19th of 1863. I remembered the following. I stated before I investigated this person that he was approximately 70 years of age, that he was hobbling on what looked like as a result of a recent injury to his leg or his hip, his upper leg, essentially. I remember that he had a characteristically sour expression. He had a distinctive appearance. I thought when I met him, it looked perhaps like what Robert F. Kennedy might have looked like at 70 had he not been assassinated at age 42. This individual was limping from his hip wound. I remember that he voluntarily helped me. He actually called out to me, boy, what are you doing out here on this cold morning without a hat, without a jacket, without any shoes? You're going to catch your grip, son. Let me take you inside and get you some shoes. Let me get you a warm jacket. So he voluntarily helped me be properly equipped in the cold November morning air. He also had a key to the millinery shop. Now, a millinery shop in 1863 in the United States was a men's accessory shop that contained things like jackets, ties, tie pins, hats, gloves, canes, and shoes. And so this individual pulled a skeleton key out of his right pocket and opened up the front door to this men's accessory shop, clothing shop, at a time in the morning when nobody was in the establishments and nobody was shopping. I don't know exactly what time it was, but I had spent about a half hour walking down from where they put me into location and into position into downtown Gettysburg. And I met him in the morning when he seemed like he had just walked over to the downtown shopping district, perhaps from his local residence. And I remember that he first took me to the back of the main floor of the shop, the front part of the shop, and pulled the largest and the oldest and the most decrepit pair of civilian shoes off the shelf. And then bending down, he was stuffing packing paper in the nature of the kind of paper that you wrap new shoes in a box before selling them to somebody or after they purchase their shoes. And he was stuffing that packing paper into the front of the shoes so that it would fit me. Now, when I found this individual online, I found that he was a Gettysburg cobbler named John Lawrence Burns. That at the time that the Gettysburg Address was held, he was 69 years of age. I had said 70, so I was only a year or less off. In his photographs, you can find the sour expression that I had described when telling of how this individual had helped me. He was limping from a hip wound because when the Battle of Gettysburg passed through his town and on its outskirts, John Lawrence Burns picked up his rifle and volunteered into the battle as a Union sharpshooter. He was wounded by a Confederate musket ball to the hip, was taken captive by Confederate forces, stated to them that he was a Gettysburg civilian who had been caught in the crossfire. And I think with some honor, the Confederate forces surrendered him back to Union lines under a flag of surrender. They permitted him to walk from where he was held with Confederate forces under a white flag of surrender and not be shot at as he was repatriated first to Union lines and then off the battlefield. So at the time I met him on November 19th of 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place from July 1st to July 4th of 1863, was only an event that had occurred about 4 months earlier, and hence a musket ball wound to the hip to a 69, 70-year-old man would have been something that he was still convalescing from. And in fact, Mr. Burns was limping severely as he was helping me as he was walking, for example, up the sidewalk, the wooden sidewalk towards me. I had stated how he had voluntarily helped me. And in fact, I found that Mr. Burns not only volunteered into the Civil War, but in his early teens was one of the first civilian volunteers into the War of 1812, in which the British attempted to take back the United States of America as a British colony, namely the American colonies as a British colony. So here we have an individual who, as a young teenager and then as a man almost 70 years of age, had volunteered into the wars of 1812 and the U.S. Civil War, which I think is remarkable. But then again, he was a person who did extend his help to other people because he took it upon himself to clothe a wayfaring young boy who walked at age 10, who walked into Gettysburg the day that the President of the United States was going to speak there. That seems like he possessed a humanitarian spirit and that volunteering to help other people was in his nature. I also noted that he had a key to the millinery shop, and certainly as one of Gettysburg's only cobblers, maybe the only cobbler in Gettysburg, it would have made sense for him to have a key to the shop where new and used men's shoes were located. That's what he outfitted me in, was a pair of size 16 men's street shoes. I also remembered that I met him in the early morning before the shops had opened, and I found by researching the life of John Lawrence Burns that he lived literally 2 Civil War era blocks from that shop. He lived literally 2 blocks down the street, which in the land use planning of 1863 would have been about 100 feet. So it was quite convenient for him to leave his house and walk down to his shop, or the shop that he was subletting from the woman who confronted him as to why he was giving away some of the shoes for sale there to this young wayfaring 10-year-old who walked into town barefoot and shivering so severely that my teeth were literally chattering in my head. And then he gave me the shoes, which is not only a voluntary act, but quite generous, and I think expressed the spirit of this great American. But then, as I described earlier, I went over to the location where after he hobbled in front of me saying, well, that's all I can do to help you, young man. The President of the United States is going to be here today, and I've got a speech to go to. So he hobbled out of the shop and over to the dais where Lincoln was going to be arriving as I shuffled forward in these grotesquely oversized shoes that he had given me. But clearly, this was the man who helped me. And I had all of those 7 or 8 details about his appearance, his age, his facial expression, the wound that he had recently experienced to his hip, the fact that he was possessed of a voluntary spirit, the fact that he had a skeleton key to the front door of a millinery shop where men's shoes were located, that he greeted me in the early morning hours before the shops were open, and then he gave me a pair of shoes. Clearly, he thought he had the franchise to give me shoes in that shop, but then again, we know historically that John Lawrence Burns was a cobbler. So it all linked up, and I knew none of these things. I didn't even know his actual identity when I wrote down the distinguishing facts that described my encounter with him, and then all of those 7 or 8 facts corresponded with the historical John Lawrence Burns. So I ended up meeting this civilian hero of the Civil War and not seeing Mr. Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. And in fact, I was crestfallen about that fact because I walked away from the dais to avoid any other further potential for being questioned extensively or arrested, because I was dressed sort of as a carpetbagger. I had some of the clothing, namely the jersey and pantaloon pants of a Union bugle boy, but then I had an adult Union winter parka and civilian shoes on. So I remembered the carpetbaggers who were following the battles and doing things like pilfering fallen soldiers' pockets and stealing their clothing. The women on the left side of the stage had been gossiping under their fans at me, as if I think they viewed me as a carpetbagger. So when I walked away from the stage to avoid being detected or arrested, dressed in this odd assemblage of valid and apparently scavenged Union clothing, I did so in an evasive move so that ultimately I didn't see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, but I met one of the civilian heroes of the war. When I later asked my father, could they send me back to Gettysburg to give me the opportunity, one more chance to see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, he said no. And I said, why? And he said, because 2 of you would be seen there. So with plasma confinement, there was definitely duplication of the same person if you sent them to the same historical event. A similar factual proof I compiled in regard to Dr. Sterling Colgate. I had written in my research notes the name Sterling Colgate, which is certainly an unusual name. It sounds like something out of a Robert Ludlum novel, but in fact it is the name of this distinguished physicist who reached the level of president of the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology. So I wrote down his name first and last, that he was a PhD in physics, that at one point it seemed that he was president of New Mexico Tech, but he was also simultaneously being referred to as the chair of their physics department. I remember my father stated that he had a tie to the Colgate-Palmolive fortune, to the Colgate family, and hence was able to source private dollars to fund Project Pegasus. I remembered that I had met him in a C-shaped building on the periphery of the grounds of New Mexico Tech in the early 70s, that building was identified as an Aerojet Corporation facility, the company founded by Theodore von Karman, that university and that corporation, that branch of that corporation, were located in Socorro, New Mexico, and that the discrete time travel technology that Dr. Colgate involved me in was plasma confinement, specifically the plasma confinement chamber. Well, when I went to New Mexico, all of these facts, I was able to tie up all of these facts. Dr. Sterling Colgate was serving as president of New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology in the early 70s. He had been chair of the physics department. He went on to have a significant professional affiliation with Los Alamos National Labs. He was related to the Colgate family. And during those years, even though it was being officially misidentified on New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology campus maps as Gibbons Hall, a student union of New Mexico Tech, the C-shaped building was in fact an Aerojet Corporation facility, as I verified through numerous people who grew up in Socorro, who remembered that corporate building being on the curtilage of the New Mexico Tech campus. But more significantly, I went into the Special Collections Department in the Research Library at New Mexico Tech, and in the box of historical records involving about Dr. Sterling Colgate and his career as a physicist and as ultimately president of that university, in the newspaper clipping file, I found a contemporaneous newspaper article from 1972 stating that he was going to be lecturing that night on his work in plasma confinement. So I did tie up all these facts regarding Dr. Colgate. I've wanted to interview him as to what he believes his work in plasma confinement involved, because there's another construction of the facts that should be asked, which is, or at least proposed, and that is, did his work in plasma confinement permit time travel, utilizing that application in quantum physics, or does he have an explanation for what he was doing in plasma confinement that may have had a quantum consequence or quantum side effects that he didn't realize was occurring? For example, maybe my involvement being sent to Gettysburg under his tutelage and that of my father was some quantum effect of his work in plasma confinement that he didn't realize would result because it was a new and experimental application in quantum physics. But then again, that possibility that some kind of shadow reality calved off as a result of his direct research in plasma confinement is rebutted by the existence of the Josephine Cobb image, where I was photographed at Gettysburg after being sent there via plasma confinement from a lab in East Hanover, New Jersey, under the direction of Dr. Colgate. In fact, I remember asking, I was kind of surprised when I saw him in New Jersey, because I'd always encountered him in New Mexico after teleporting there sometimes. And I said, Dr. Colgate, what are you doing here? And he said, Andrew, the adults in the program are also teleporting. He was a very taciturn individual, a very quiet man, had a very placid personality. I remember he often kept his hands in his white lab coat, was very slow to anger or to respond really very quickly to anything anybody said. He was a very quiet, placid, deliberative personality, a deliberate person. And again, he was a person of very high caliber, like all of the individuals that I had the privilege of serving with in Project Pegasus at the dawn of the time-space age. So looking now at the future, not at the past, not at a brief history of time travel, but prospectively at the future that now awaits us, as quantum access via time travel technologies that are now over 40 years old becomes publicly understood, and I lobby for declassification and disclosure of teleportation so that we can use it for real-time transport in the civilian sector, even running and winning the presidency to achieve that, if I must. Let's look at the public policy choices that we are confronted by here in Section 6, the choices. Essentially, we have to start from the premise of what we know is true. and the significance of my work, which I view as my life's work at this point, really can be encapsulated in the following. First of all, the people of the world need to know that time travel technology was theoretically developed and successfully reduced to practice secretly by the U.S. defense technical community over 40 years ago. It was used to place U.S. personnel in non-ordinary domains in time-space over 30 years ago. That one of the time travel technologies that was developed, namely Tesla teleportation, which doesn't disintegrate the teleportee and then reintegrate them at the destination, but rather does the opposite, opens up the universe around the teleportee so that the teleportee passes uninjured through a vortal tunnel in the time-space continuum. That technology needs to be declassified, that it holds one of the major keys to resolving the crisis of environment and development in the 21st century, and that's why I'm speaking out about the existence of these technologies. We are going to be needing teleportation simply not just to thrive, but to survive in the 21st century. There's also the political ramifications that have gone unannounced and unexplored by the public at large. The fact, for example, that U.S. presidents are being briefed of their presidencies decades in advance. I don't know the extent of the briefings that the previous presidents got, but I know that certainly by the time I left the jump room program at age 21 in 1983, 21, 22, that I had been briefed about my future presidency. Do I know that presidency has to happen to me or on the timeline we're on? No. Maybe we're now on another timeline where I pursue the presidency and don't win it. But certainly I'm going to be announcing for presidency for the 2016 election, and there's certainly a chance that I might win. I certainly am going to run to win. But I don't want to boast because I'm really trying to maintain the integrity of my truth campaign and share with the American people that I was told I would one day win the presidency, not try to become president by saying that it's some inevitability resulting from having been briefed in the past. That's certainly not logical. But yes, time travel has affected the presidents at a minimum. And also I'm disturbed by the fact that time travel remains secret and it's viewed as speculative by the public, which means that the public is being kept back from understanding what the state of the art is of our technical development in this civilization on Earth. And that's regressive, it's retrogressive, it's non-Republican in its emphasis as a form of government, and I mean small r Republican. It doesn't embody an expression of the Republican form of government, the notion of government by consent of the governed, for this critical information to be kept back from the citizens, let's say, of just even a country like the United States, where the citizens are supposed to determine the direction that civilization takes, that our country takes. So with those broad issues identified, let's look at some of the trade-offs. Let's start first with teleportation. Simply put, teleportation, as we see in this slide, is either going to become a public transport technology or it's going to remain a secret weapon of war. Now, what would be the benefit of it becoming a public form of transport? Well, look at this. Look at even the most advanced forms of transport that the public enjoys today. For example, commercial air travel. Despite the advent of commercial air travel still involves long flights, sometimes does, at least during international travel. It involves long flights that are inconvenient to get on, that are expensive, that are fatiguing, and that present a greater threat of injury to men and women alike. All air travelers are subject to a greater risk of things like blood clots or coronary thrombosis from blood clots, to the pooling of the blood that puts circulation at risk and even our vital organs and extremities at risk. For women, namely pregnant women, commercial air travel presents the health risk of birth defects and miscarriages involving their unborn infants. And hence, I don't believe we should view even the most advanced forms of air travel as necessarily what we should settle for as a global civilization. Look at some of the long-distance trips that are still being taken. To get from London, England to the Antipodes, to Auckland, New Zealand, to Sydney, Australia, still takes 24 hours when the traveler travels on most forms of commercially available air transport. I think we can do better. Imagine getting from London to Sydney, not in 24 hours, but in several seconds. That capability has been available since 1970. So we can make transportation faster, safer, less fatiguing, less medically jeopardizing, less expensive financially, and more environmentally benevolent if we introduce it and use it as much as possible to take our existing airports and turn them into teleports, so that instead of getting on an airplane, passengers would be sitting in a jump room that would then be teleported through a portal tunnel in time space to reach the destination in a safe way. That technology has been available not for 40 years, but for 30 years. It was a technology that was used to get those of us who were jumping off planet to our destinations. So, because this state-of-the-art exists, this best available technology, I think we're under a scientific, a practical, and a moral obligation to use that best available technology to advantage our fellow human beings. Now, if that doesn't happen, if vortal teleportation remains sequestered in the military-industrial complex as a secret weapon of war, the historical tragedy embodied in the time travel cover-up as it affects transportation will simply continue. And what is absolutely foolish about that is that when DARPA began investigating and questioning whether vortal teleportation could be used as a weapon of war, it was found that it probably couldn't be, because wherever there are water deposits, there would be a risk to the soldiers who would be arriving on the battlefield or being positioned near the battlefield via Tesla teleportation. So, for example, in the same way that the little boy lost his feet in Santa Fe during the early days of time-space exploration under Project Pegasus in the early 70s, future Marines and Navy SEALs and combat infantry entering the theater of combat via teleportation would also be put at risk of death and dismemberment by the threat of arriving where there are water deposits. Do the Navy SEALs arrive in coastal areas where there's water in the ocean or in marshes near the shore? Yes. Do the Marines? Yes. Do combat infantry disembark into areas where there's marshy waters, recent rainwater, cisterns of water, and so forth? Yes. So most of the soldiers and sailors and Marines who would be arriving via teleportation would have an enhanced risk of injury arriving via teleportation because of water deposits on the battlefield or near the battlefield. That threat to human health and the physical integrity of the teleportees, however, could be absolutely controlled for in commercial teleports, because the jump rooms would be arriving in dry sanitary infrastructure that would not have natural water deposits that could dismember any of the teleportees. So clearly the benefits outweigh the costs, the opportunities outweigh the constraints, and if I can't achieve the declassification and deployment of teleportation by 2016, I'm going to be running for the presidency of the United States calling for declassification, and if I win the presidency, I will lead the effort to declassify, I will declassify teleportation, and I will lead the effort internationally to engage in the technology transfer that's necessary to convert all of our airports, at least as much as possible, into teleports. This, I think, will be an important advancement of the 21st century. Now let's take a look at the chronovision technology. I state in this slide, chronovision. Is it going to be looking glass technology or remain looking at technology? Well, that's the trade-off. Quantum access via chronovision, the ability to retrieve a second or third or fourth dimensional picture or hologram of a non-local event. A non-local event simply because the event is going on at a removed distant in space or at a removed distant in both time and space, in places we would call the past or the future, has also been available from 1970, since 1970. And the fact that the U.S. government is secretly in possession of this form of technical remote viewing technology presents a threat that it'll be abused by a tyrannical government. Chronovision, if kept secretly by the United States government, could become the surveillance technology of a 24-hour police state, basically the 24-hour surveillance technology of a dystopian reality, of a police state equipped not only with bad cops who batter citizens, but literally an intrusive technology, a disruptive technology that violates any semblance of individual and group privacy, which is not only a fundamental societal value, but as Justice Douglas stated in the Griswold v. Connecticut decision, the right to privacy is an emanation from the penumbra of the notions of privacy embodied in different amendments that we find in the U.S. Bill of Rights. For example, the Fourth Amendment right to be protected from unreasonable search and seizure has implications in terms of the fundamental rights that are violated when a technology is used to remotely search somebody's life, their dwelling, or some other private location. So if we don't declassify chronovision, we will not be protected from the kind of program that President George W. Bush sponsored when he asked Admiral William Poindexter to launch a program of total information awareness during the Bush presidency. What agency was this program of total information awareness going to be placed under? It was going to be placed under DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the very U.S. defense weapons and intelligence gathering development agency that gave the U.S. government time travel and which has been kept secret by the U.S. government. So we need to increase public awareness that these technologies exist. If they already are or will one day be abused by government to violate any semblance, any remaining expression of the fundamental human right to privacy. Now, there would be a way to utilize chronovision in a pro-social way, and I support it. That would be to create a public-private agency with both governmental and non-governmental representation on the commission that would guide this agency. It could be called, for example, the Agency of Quantum History. And this agency under, I don't know, let's say the Department of Interior or the National Archives in the United States, would have an ongoing program where they would source non-local images of things like auspicious moments in human history. You know, the signing of the Magna Carta, events like that. William Shakespeare writing one of his plays. Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address. Things that were not photographed very well or that were never filmed. It would identify auspicious moments in human history and establish a global network of quantum museums and libraries where members of the general public could go into those establishments and view moving holographic images of the great moments in human history. But the same program would also restrict generalized public access to images that would violate the privacy not only of living human beings or future ones, but of historical figures. So in that sense, all of us would want to see Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address, but none of us should see Abraham Lincoln visiting the Privy or making love to Mrs. Lincoln. Those are violations of individual privacy. And so as part of this program that I'm urging, when chronovision is declassified, we would uphold a standard of individual and group privacy where chronovision would be used on a limited public access basis, where the generalized public would only be allowed to be, or enabled to view literally auspicious moments in history, but not to turn all of human history, past, present, and future, into some generalized form of social pornography or invasion of privacy. That's not right, and that would be an abusive use of chronovision technology. Similar in its operation, but perhaps different in its impact, were chronovision to remain simply the leading eavesdropping technology of a 24-hour surveillance state. So the advent of chronovision is just as significant, maybe even more significant than the advent of teleportation, and it's something that we're going to need law and policy formation to deal with. So what's my agenda, and why am I speaking out, and why have I accepted the gracious invitation of our distinguished president of Exo University, Alfred Lambremont Webre, in giving this lecture today for your course program in time travel? Well, I have a 5-year agenda, and that will be to sustain my truth campaign about secret U.S. advancements in time travel and in jump room technology. I will continue to speak out about my experiences, share my experiences in Project Pegasus and the jump room program in both the mainstream media and alternative media. and also in academic fora such as Exo University. And then when I run for president in 2016, part of my platform will be the declassification and deployment in a rational and socially constructive way of the time travel technologies that we have taken a brief look at today in my presentation, A Brief History of Time Travel. Thank you for listening, and thank you for enrolling in Exo University.